So we're just about ready to start. Could I actually make a point to everyone? It's rather late in the day, but when you're talking into the microphone in your comments and questions, the microphone is not attached to the internet. It comes to speakers here, and the speakers then go through that computer, the normal computer microphone, onto the internet. So as a result, can you speak loudly and clearly anyway into the microphone, and preferably just walk to the front here and deliver your question or whatever you have to say, and then people on the online will not have a problem hearing what you're saying. Okay, we're not many people here, so it's easy to move around. Now, so for this session, welcome Alexander Fantalkin, who's going to speak to us on Mediterranean chronology during the Iron Age. Where do we stand? Would you like to start?
Yes, please. Thank you.
Right, welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So, Mediterranean chronology during the Iron Age, where do we stand? And following Stefanos' lecture, apparently we stand on the different sides of a barricade. So, first of all, much of the relative ceramic typology for the Iron Age in the Aegean is well established, as we know, and since Greek decorated pottery was frequently traded throughout the Mediterranean, this relative system, which is based on rapid changes in style, provides the entire basin from Spain to the Levant with excellent anchors for the study of cultural connections. However, it is difficult to tie this Aegean relative sequence of the Iron Age to the absolute dating system. And this is so, as well as they heard, that because the period between the late Helladic 3C in the late 2nd millennium BC and the archaic colonization of Italy and Sicily toward the end of the 8th century lacks archaeological context in Greece with clear absolute dates that could be tied directly to the Egyptian absolute dates, for instance. So let's take a look on the upper anchors, which are basically unquestionable. So we have these correlations between Amarna and the Aegean late Helladic 3A2. And of course, we have a pretty well-established correlation between late Helladic 3C and its different stages with the arrival of so-called sea people and associated pottery to the shores of the Levant. And I think here, this is unquestionable. Lower anchors are also pretty good established based on Thucydides, chronology for Greek colonization of Sicily and so in Italy. And despite criticism, which is already voiced for decades, starting with Van Camparnole, Miller's studies, that claimed that any information concerning Greek settlement history in Sicily during the archaic period is a result of artificial calculations based upon the length of generation in the genealogical lists available to Thucydides. Actually, this chronology works pretty well, and the confirmation comes from different parts of the world, in particular from the Levant, from Israel, destruction layers associated with the Babylonian destruction of Nebuchadnezzar II. So the campaign during which Ashkelon was destroyed in November, December 604. We even know the month. And in the destruction layer, a dozen of early Corinthian sherds were discovered. Destruction layers associated with Smyrna and Assesos, again, in this case caused by Aliatis, though, but also from the late 7th century with abandoned early Corinthian pottery inside the destruction layers. So basically, the chronology suggested so many years ago by Humphrey Pine stands with some slight modest modification, and the reliability of Bokoris scarab found in Pithecusae still remains strong. Although the date of Bokoris actually could be changed a little bit between 725 and 720, as it used to be just 6 years ago to maybe 716, 711, due to the changes in the chronology of the 25th dynasty and the reign of Shebitku and Shabako. But actually this tiny modification even fits much better the modifications, very slight modifications suggested by Amix and later by Nift, of course, to Pine's chronology. But in general, this chronology stands, and we can see that it is actually anchored very well from the late 8th century, from early Proto-Corinthian sequence, due to this Bocoris scarab in Petikusae, and the early Corinthian shards, which are firmly dated by Ashkelon destruction layer, but also by Metzad Chashavyau and the destructions layers in Ionia, as I mentioned earlier. So the lowest anchors are pretty well established. And in between, we have this chronological sandwich, which is in the center of this talk, of course. Let's say between late Helladic 3C, the final stages of late Helladic 3C, of course, and the late geometric 2, more or less. And we already heard from Stefanos about this earlier before the break. So this is the famous scheme suggested by Coldstream, and when Coldstream and before Desborough and others, then they tried to work out this chronological scheme, as it is well known, they were forced to turn to the Levant, to the Northern Levant, and to the Southern Levant in order to get some reliable dates. Otherwise, it was impossible to tie this relative Greek sequence to absolute dates. So from the Northern Levant, they had this, Coldstream had a certain amount of information from Tel Chama, but mostly he based his chronological sequence based on the evidence supplied by the Southern Levant and the sites like Megiddo, Tel Aboram, of course, Samaria, etc. As we all know by now, these sites on many occasions, or the shards on which Coldstream relied, these shards, they came from questionable contexts. For instance, the most famous shard and the vessel from Tel Aboram 3, which once upon a time, scholars used to believe that it was destroyed by Shoshank, biblical Shishak, in the late 10th century BC, but it's not entirely clear that this is indeed the case. Of course, Samaria with its very questionable stratigraphy, and in the center there was Megiddo, the famous stratum 5A 4B, which was dated back then to the 10th century, to the period of United Kingdom, to the days of King Solomon, all based on the famous passage in the First Kings, which claims that Solomon built Milo and the wall of Jerusalem and Hatzor and Megiddo and Gezer, and in Hatzor, Megiddo and Gezer, a particular type of a gate, six-chambered gate, was discovered, and the strata which were associated with these gates were proclaimed to be from the 10th century BC. Two pieces actually of middle geometric, Attic middle geometric 1, early Skyphos, were reported from Megiddo, from this presumably 10th century stratum, from Megiddo 5A 4B, and as I said, this stratum, according to what used to be conventional, or now we call it high Levantine chronology, this stratum was supposed to be dated to the 10th century. That is to say, between the destruction, which was associated with King David destruction around 1000 BC in Megiddo, and the destruction which was associated with Shoshank, so in 10th century. On the other hand, Kenyon, following Crowfoot chronology, developed all in Samaria. She suggested a later date in the 9th century for the pottery found in Megiddo 5A 4B, based on parallels from Samaria, suggesting the separation between so-called building period and pottery period at Samaria and Megiddo. When Coldstream worked out on his famous chronological scheme, he was forced to deal with these two competing chronology. He called the so-called high chronology that used to be accepted back then in Palestine. He called this chronology the Hatzorite chronology, or it's high. It used to be accepted chronology back then. And the low chronology of Crawford Canyon, he called it the Samarian chronology. So here you can see the basic arrangement of different Greek pottery styles arranged according to the major points of the so-called high chronology, where, for example, this Megiddo middle geometric sherd would be dated to the 10th century, somewhere here, versus the so-called low chronology based on a suggestion of Catlin Canyon from Samaria with implications for Megiddo chronology as well. Using these two systems, Coldstream, apparently, as we all know, was preferred, actually, the low chronology. The low chronology advocated by Canyon, despite the fact that Canyon herself, later on, actually in early 70s, she accepted the so-called high chronology for so-called Solomonic strata, but that went unmentioned on the Aegean side. And for several decades, actually, the Aegean chronology for the Iron Age was completely baseless. In any event, Coldstream based his chronology on Canyon's low chronology and arrived to the following division, where, for example, a middle geometric period, which is even in Coldstream's scheme, is quite long, 100 years, plus minus, of course, should be no more than 100 years, because otherwise, if you accept the so-called high chronology advocated by high supporters of the high dates, again, back then it was accepted by everybody, at least in Israel. So if you follow this reasoning, you're supposed to date actually the whole middle geometric sequence to at least 200 years between 10th century and 8th century. And for Coldstream, this was a little bit too much. So he followed much more reasonable, in his opinion, at least in my too, but in his opinion, he followed much more reasonable low alternative. This low chronology nowadays, actually, it's for the last 20 or something years, preoccupies almost 30 years. It preoccupies most of the scholars who work on the Iron Age material in the Southern Levant. This so-called low chronology advocated back then by Catlin Canyon and abandoned by her, by the way, gains a lot of support from the side of general down dating of the Iron Age strata in Israel, and it was initiated by David Usishkin, and later on mostly by Israel Finkelstein with what we call so-called Finkelstein low chronology. And at the moment in Israel, what we have a so-called low chronology, a so-called high chronology, and so-called modified conventional chronology. So I will explain in a second what does it mean. Basically, the differences are not so longer pronounced between the supporters of the low chronology and the so-called modified conventional chronology. And why so? Because it is obvious that the dates that we used to attribute 30, 40 years ago to the so-called 10th century horizon of the United Kingdom, these dates should be shifted later into the 9th century. Finkelstein chronology, although he arrived to this chronology without any connection to Crowfoot and Canyon, it's in a way mirrors Canyon's chronology, although as I said, Finkelstein arrived to this chronology using a completely different set of arguments. So, and this different set of arguments includes a lot of destruction layers in the Southern Levant, starting from the collapse of the Egyptian rule and the expansion of what we call the early proto-Israelite polity in the islands, and destruction layers that could be perhaps associated with this expansion, the conflicts during the days of the Omrid dynasty and the Shishon campaigns, and the associated destruction layers, and of course the destruction layers attributed to Hazael and to Aramean destructions in the late 9th century, which could be firmly now associated with the layers both in the north and in the south, in Tel Gat, for example, and also in the many sites in the north. So now, basically, the differences that used to be prominent just maybe a decade ago between the modified conventional chronology that tried to accumulate this new understanding of the very long Iron 2A horizon, which extends much beyond the 10th century and extends well into the 9th century, the differences between this modified conventional chronology and low chronology are no longer pronounced that much. So at the beginning, the modified conventional chronology advocated by Ami Mazar and others who follow this suit, at the beginning, they tried to claim that the end of the Iron One should be put in Israel and Southern Levant around 980. This is in order to allow still for King David's destruction horizons, but the end was already set by them, not in the end of the 10th century, but in the end of the 9th century, because it was clear that this horizon continues toward the Aramean destructions. Now, following Zinger Avitz and the Zev Herzog correction, which was offered also a few decades ago, it is now obvious to everyone who deals with the Iron Age chronology in Southern Levant that this horizon, Iron 2A horizon, should be divided between early and late at least. And now it is accepted basically by all participants of this endless dispute that the beginning of the Iron 2A should be set as somewhere around middle of the 10th century BC. So if low chronology at the beginning, Finkelstein low chronology at the beginning advocated the date around 920, so now we all close it to 950 BC, and this is more or less, you see, the horizons which characterize the sequence of the Iron Age in Israel, based on not only on historical considerations, but also on hundreds of radiocarbon dates, of course, of which I will outline in a minute. Now, inside of this sequence, so basically we are now following this sequence, the sequence of Coldstream, not the sequence of the high chronology. Inside of this sequence, we can enter a lot of Greek shards, Greek vessels, admittedly, not so many. I would like, of course, to have more of them in order to be able to beef up this picture. But even what we have is enough, I think, in order to provide a reliable proto-geometric and geometric chronology. So let's take a look. We have, first of all, we have very good correlations between different sites. For example, this early Attic middle geometric skyphos from Megiddo, the famous one from Megiddo 5a, 4b, has the exact parallel in Tel Rehov 4, and in both cases, they are securely dated to the 9th century BC. More shards, by the way, are constantly popping out and being discovered. For instance, just recently, a few early geometric shards were discovered in Tel Abel Bet Marka, and more shards are coming out. Some of them are still unpublished. So apparently, this picture, it will be possible to add more vessels and shards into this picture. And here we stand with these two possibilities. So in one possibility would follow the original call stream scheme, perhaps with a few modifications, but really minor ones. And another one would follow the suit of the high Palestinian chronology, what used to be once conventional chronology, but now it's completely obsolete. Nobody uses this chronology any longer, at least in our quarters. Now, let's take a look on these Greek shards from the Levant and the radiometric dates, which were dismissed previously by Stefanos as not reliable. So first of all, Tel Rehov, we have 45 Iron Age samples, 153 radiocarbon dates, mostly from charred grain and olive stones, not from bones, not from wood. 110 days, repetitive measurements, 14 shards, but most importantly, stratigraphically, these shards are deposited in sequential typological order. That is to say, from proto-geometric up to middle geometric. So, and this was recently published by Amichai Mazar and Notakuru. Notakuru dealt with this assemblage, and they postulated that all these Greek shards, they deposited in sequential typological order with accompanying radiocarbon dates that again provide a support, an independent support for established for the chronology established by Coldstream. The same holds true for Megiddo. In Megiddo, we don't have so many Greek shards, but in Megiddo, we have a lot of radiocarbon dates. So we have only short-lived samples. We have the whole sequence from the late Bronze Age down to the Iron Age 2A late, all based, also short-lived samples based on olive pits and cereal grains, and the dates for the strata which yielded Greek pottery also follow the suit of accepted Aegean chronology and not the high Egyptian, not the high alternative to that. To this, we should add, of course, the radiocarbon dates from Tel Adar with its famous proto-geometric, late proto-geometric lebes, dates from Tel Dor with hundreds of dates actually from Tel Dor with its late proto-geometric shards, etc., etc. So the picture is quite clear, at least to my mind. Using this data, Israel Finkelstein, Eli Pisetsky, and myself, we published a few years ago an article which presented the sequence, a radiocarbon-based dating scheme for the entire Aegean ceramic sequence from late Helladic 3B2 to middle geometric 2, with implications, of course, for late Cypriot to Cypriot geometric free ceramic phases. We did it exercising what we call chronology by proxy. We turned to radiocarbon date strata in the Levant, but in the entire southern Levant, including Syria and Cyprus and Israel, that produced Aegean-related and corresponding Cypriot pottery items that represent most of the late Helladic 3B middle geometric, all the way down to middle geometric sequence. The dates presented in this article strongly support, with a few minor adjustments, that the conventional Aegean chronology, low chronology in Levantine terms, should be sustained. Another study that we published just a few years ago about the date and the origin of the black on red Cypriot ware from Megiddo accumulated all possible information regarding the black on red, accompanying Greek black on red, accompanying Greek shards, all come from the same building, from the same structure, with very high quality radiocarbon dates. And again, it all follows the conventional Aegean chronology. Our pilot, which we tried to conduct in Greece approximately 10, 15 years ago, was not very successful because it was very difficult back then to detect reliable context for radiocarbon dates. Actually, most of the scholars, they it's not that they didn't want to cooperate, but they didn't really understand why do we need this. But in any event, we were able to collect some good data from Lefkandi, from Kalapodi, and from Corinth with the help of Irene Lemos, Rainer Felsch, Wolf-Dietrich Niemeyer, Guy Sanders, of course, so with the help of the excavators. And the major conclusion of this article is that the radiocarbon dates, based on the results which we obtained from these sites, would put the transition from the submycenaean to early protogeometric somewhere in the second half of the 11th century, which again is very similar to general scheme suggested already by Kolstrom. And I do think that submycenaean represent a separate chronological stage, maybe not so long as Florian Rupinstein suggested, but relatively short period. I think it's actually should be accepted that we are dealing with a relatively short period, which can be perhaps also dated by radiocarbon dates. In any event, these are the results which we obtained in Greece. And now let's go to suggestions to go all the way back to so-called ultra-high Palestinian chronology based on the evidence from a number of sites in the Mediterranean already outlined by Stefanos. So I will demonstrate you that in my opinion, this evidence should be considered in a completely different manner. And the most famous, of course, these are the dates from Kastanos and Asiros. The dates from Kastanos I'm not going to discuss. Weniger and Jung, they already dismissed these dates in 2009 in a very convenient manner, I would say, at least in my opinion. Asiros is a big problem. According to Wardell, the late Helladic 3C early, the phase 7, probably also middle as well. It's not clear from the description. It should start already in 1341, and it ends between 1312 and the beginning of the 13th century. So this would disconnect this pottery family completely from the reign of Ramses III by more than 100 years, which is, in my opinion, totally impossible, because we have, recall, this chronological anchor between late Helladic 3C and Ramses III. So I just simply don't understand how that would work. According to Wardell et al., the beginning of early protogeometrics should be set around end of the 12th century, if not earlier, and this is very much in line with recent data from Stindos. So problems, the complexity of correlating the only 104-year tree-ring sequence that was obtained from oak timbers from Asiros with Anatolian master dendrochronological sequence based on juniper. Timber items sampled at Asiros perhaps were recycled from earlier structures, perhaps. Alternatively, the so-called Kettling Group 1 amphora, this one, attested that Asiros did not develop chromatic protogeometric types, but represent stylistically dependent product of the Northern Aegean, thus shared Oliver Dickinson. I'm not going to enter this discussion, whatever you take. Carthage, we heard about the high dates from Carthage, but again, the devil or the god, whatever you call it, it's always in details. So when you go to these dates and you see that the dates, they came from a pit, and the Greek sherds and questions, they come from the upmost layer, this one, but and they presumably, the dates here, they are much higher than they're supposed to be based on the conventional Aegean chronology. The problem is that these 3 dates here, just beneath, they were taken out of calculation by Van der Plicht, Nieboer, and others who conducted this analysis. Needless to say, a deposition in a pit is not a secure context for radiocarbon. the fact that the determination from the upper layer is earlier than those from the 3 layers below perhaps indicates that pit is not stratified, but let's assume that the layers in the pit do provide reliable stratigraphy, and Roald Doctor, with whom I checked this, he claims that it is reliable stratigraphy, and I believe him. So in this case, contra to Van der Plich et al., one cannot ignore the samples from the layers, these samples, which were ignored in the model suggested by Van der Plich and others. And once, ostensibly due to the problematic location of the calibration curve, but once you take these samples into consideration, you arrive to accepted dates for the Greek pottery, which, as I said, was discovered here in the upper layer. And the same holds true, and by the way, Roald Doctor would agree with me on that. I also checked this with him back then. And the same holds true for Utica and these new dates from Utica. I didn't even bring it here because it all comes from the pit with very questionable stratigraphic association. But let's go further. Huelva, we already heard that Huelva is completely unreliable. Phrygia, Gordion, the destruction layer and the destruction level in Gordion, which is now associated instead of 700 to Sumerian destruction to late 9th century BC, was presumably taken by some scholars as something that would support high Aegean chronology, but it's not the case. A few Aegean pieces which were found in post-destruction layers, they actually go very well with the new dates. The same holds true for Italy, and I'm not going to embark on Italy here, but it was all sufficiently summarized in a series of articles. So here, there was a very long dispute between Van der Plich, Bruins, and Nieboer that suggested a high chronology perspective from Groningen radiocarbon database, rebutted by us, Strad Finkelstein, Pisetsky, and myself, Erich Joinder. We had a reply, and we replied in another article, a reply to the reply, and basically at the moment we stopped. But now, and of course, before we turn to Syndos for a few minutes, which I still have, of course, we should mention the attempts of Dirk Brandhelm, Martin Traxel, and others who tried already before Stephanos to establish the ultra high Aegean chronology based on radiocarbon dates, again from Carthage and from other places. But it suffices to take a look on this table of Martin Traxel in order to realize the problem. Martin Traxel, in order to create this new high chronology for the Aegean Iron Age, he had to play also with the lower, with the upper and with the lower anchors. And sometimes when you play with something inside of the scheme, you have to move the entire scheme back and forth. And for example, let's take a look only here on the early Corinthian sequence. In Traxel's scheme, the early Corinthian should be placed between 650 and 625. But as I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, in Ashkelon destruction layer, dated to 604, we found only early Corinthian and not a single piece of Middle Corinthian. So if Traxel is correct, we would presumably be supposed to find Middle Corinthian in the destruction layers associated with Babylonians in Israel, and this is not the case. So this scheme simply does not work. And now let's go for a few minutes to Syndos and to the data which was presented just a couple of years ago in PLOS ONE in 2020 by Stephanos and Bernhard Wenninger. So we have this very complicated stratigraphy in a way, but it seems that it's very nice and good looking. 21 dates obtained from the bones. And what are the consequences of this chronology that was presented earlier, just before the break by Stephan? So the consequences are, so these are the dates suggested based on the new chronology from Syndos. I'm not dealing here at the moment with the late geometric 2 and the Syrian destructions and Proto-Corinthian chronology, Egyptian synchronism. Let's take a look only here in the upper scale of this. The transition between late Helladic 3A2 and late Helladic 3B1 should be set around 1290, 1280. The transition between late Helladic 3B2 and late Helladic 3C early 1 should be set around somewhere in the first quarter of the 12th century. So it's undisputable, at least in my opinion. That means if we accept these new dates from Syndos, that means that we should squeeze the entire late Helladic, which by all means should be very long, actually. It's early, middle, and late. Plus sub-Mycenaean, we should squeeze all this into less than 50 years. In my opinion, this is simply impossible. So if it's impossible, so what's going on? Why do we have these dates in such high dates in Syndos? Let's take a look for a few minutes to publication of Die Stadt Syndos, the final report produced by Stefanos, and let's take a look on this stratigraphic location of the based on which we're supposed to change the entire chronology of the Iron Age and the entire Mediterranean. So this is the famous section which we already saw, and I just show you one of the quality contexts. For example, phase 7, late geometric 1A. One reads that it's likely that
just for 1 second. I'm going to give you another 2 minutes to finish up. Okay, thanks.
I'm finishing. 2 minutes is okay. Yeah. So the Earth was brought from elsewhere. That may explain the occurrence of few fragments of vessels from the late Bronze and late Neolithic in this section. So the context may be mixed. I don't know. Maybe not. But the site has produced a lot of geometric shards. But when we take a look on this, for instance, amphora illustrated in this +1 article, this amphora, late geometric 1A amphora, it comes from area delta. It comes here. The radiocarbon dates, they come from here. They come from the section AO. And once we try to plot the shards reported by Stefanos in his own report associated with the levels which were tested by radiocarbon, we see that for late protogeometric phase 11, we have one piece. For early geometric from this section, we have a few pieces. For middle geometric, we have a few pieces. Middle geometric 2, we have a few pieces. So what might be a problem here? I don't know. Problem, pottery association, I don't think so. Stratigraphy, don't know. Mixed context, no idea. But maybe Stuart Manning has suggested that maybe a C4 plant in the diet, like millet, Brucor millet is reported from both Asiros and Castanas. Other possibilities that animals grazed on the seashore or in the delta ate some seaweed, and that might raise concerns that the ages are too old due to some marine reservoir component. I really have no idea why the dates are so high there, but and here I end my talk. I don't think that this new evidence from Syndos or from any other part of the world, at least so far, would justify to change the conventional Aegean chronology. And I think the conventional Aegean chronology, as advocated by Kolstrom, is still very much solid. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So the phrase comes to mind, never the twain shall meet, for you and Stefanos Himitzidis.
Until God sits presently, no, until the God sits presently, last man judgment seat. Yeah, that's it.
And clearly, what you've both been talking about requires another entire conference, rather than, I'm afraid, this sort of 1 hour that we've made for it here. But I will open the discussion for a short time, and certainly if Stefanos would like to make any comments, welcome. Otherwise, anyone else on this particularly contentious subject. I must say that, you know, just to think of LH3C going so early is difficult, but I'm a traditionalist, you know, I've been taught by people like Nicholas Coldstream, so I'm entirely biased, but it's a very complex subject. Ah, yes. Do speak, Stefanos.
Okay, thank you. Great to see you, Alex, and thank you so much for the paper. I didn't expect less than that, to be honest. But look, Alex, if we want to be serious, I mean, we have to see some things and to admit some things. The first thing is that we can't argue that the proto-geometric style was invented at Asyros, site where a single pot was found, and 100 years after Asyros, it was transmitted to Athens. I will not get into details about the other issues. And Syndos, well, look, Alex, the stratigraphic trends where the radiocarbon dates came from produced more than 2,000 rim shards, statistically analyzed, and not only typologically, but also technologically. I am a Bernard Hazel's school student, and we work there a lot with pottery fabrics and technology, which means that seriation, pottery sequence, we achieve that not only by means of types, as you do already in Israel, of course, but we also consider technology. This is fabrics. By taking into consideration these two factors, we can achieve, we can have some picture about the consistency of the layers. And if pottery is consistent, I mean, absolute consistent, what you said about the mixed context, these were 5 wall shards from early Neolithic pottery among more than 30,000 shards of pottery that is Iron Age pottery. I mean, the outliers are so few. And you can see that in the published, well, in the publication already. And the question is, if it is so with the pottery, why should the animal bones be mixed? To be honest, when I got first time the results from Syndos, I was astonished. I didn't know what to do with them. I was a supporter of the conventional chronology, and I also ignored Asyros. But now I'm afraid that I cannot do that anymore. And look, it's not that simple with Utica. In Utica, you just dismissed everything. Now, Utica is not important. No. Alex, Utica produced more than 60 geometric shards, almost double so much as you have in the whole Israel, and a lot of radiocarbon dates from a very well context. So you cannot dismiss everything like that. And you have to admit that you are recycling arguments that have been used since 60 years. The very same Ostraka from Israel, always as arguments about the conventional chronology. And don't forget Sidon, which produced also new data, a lot new data, and Sidon is actually the second largest assemblage of Greek geometric pottery in the Eastern Mediterranean. So I will not comment on the arguments you used. We can do that privately, and this is what I wanted to tell you. We had a very nice discussion a month ago on Ibiza, on the Phoenician Archaeology Conference with Aigelet Gilboa and Gunnar Lehmann. Part of this discussion were also the Spanish colleagues from Utica, Alfredo Medeiros Martin and José Luis Castro. And we suggested that we have to make some workshop to discuss all these issues that have to do with misunderstandings. And what I call misunderstandings is misunderstandings from the Near Eastern archaeology about Greek pottery seriation, our misunderstandings about your Phoenician pottery seriation. My suggestion is that you have high resolution radiocarbon data in Israel, but the Greek pottery finds that you showed and that they were reworked by Notakuru, etc., they were overinterpreted. There are very few, very small shards, very few of them can be precisely dated. and they cannot help the correlation between Israel and the Aegean. Well, they do, but not in the sense that you are suggesting. So my suggestion is that you can join this group and let's do a discussion, proper discussion. How can we solve this discrepancy? It is a discrepancy that has to do with correlation of relative chronological systems, not absolute chronology. Thank you.
Thanks very much. That seems very well said, to have a workshop and to get you all involved. And then you'll get some extremely good results out of it, I'm sure.
Shall I answer?
Would you like yes, I'm about to say, would you like a final word? Briefly.
Okay. Very briefly. So, Stefanos, thank you very much. I, of course, disagree with almost every point you have raised here, and I can demonstrate it quite in the proper manner, but we simply have no time for this. Recycling arguments, this is not the case at all. If argument stands and works pretty well, there is no problem to recycle it. It's a problem to bring new arguments which stands on a very shaky basis, as it is demonstrated by Sindos, at least in my opinion. So I don't think we should change the good accepted chronology that works from the entire Mediterranean. But I'm ready always to be open to new suggestions, although I'm in Sidon, as I have to see first the publication of Sidon. And I'm pretty much sure that even in Sidon case, I will find a lot of problems, but we'll see.
For sure you will find, Alexander, I don't have, I am sure that you will find also problems in the Sidon chronology.
Thank you both very, very much.